welcome to Scary Mary. Lie back, relax your hands, your neck, your thoughts. The world outside fades, and the story takes its place. These are scary stories for brave dreams. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment if you enjoy the calm inside the dark. There are crimes that become legends, not because of their cruelty or the skill of their execution, but because of the unsolvable mystery that hangs around them like a fog. They become overgrown with rumors, theories, songs, and sayings. The name Lizzie Borden is known, probably, to every American. But what lies behind that name? Not just a line from a scary rhyme, but a real drama that played out on a sweltering summer day in 1892 in the sleepy industrial town of Fall River, Massachusetts. This is not just a story about murder. It is a story about class prejudice, about Victorian conventions, about family secrets boiling under the roof of a respectable house. It is the trial of a woman who dared not fit into the framework prescribed for her by society. And to understand what happened in that house on 2nd Street, we must first immerse ourselves in the world in which Lizzie Borden lived, a world where behind lace curtains and strict suits, passions, hatred, and death were concealed. Imagine Fall River in the late 19th century, a city built on the textile industry. Its streets are saturated not only with the smell of the river, but also with the smell of money, social ambition, and hard labor. Here, people knew clearly who was one of their own and who was an outsider. The Borden family occupied a strange, ambiguous position in this hierarchy. They were rich. Oh, yes. Andrew Borden, the head of the family, had amassed a fortune in real estate and banking, but they were devoid of what was valued in Fall River's high society: refinement, social graces, brilliance. They were considered misers, people without sophistication, upstarts, and at the center of this world, in a dark, stuffy, uncomfortable house, lived 32-year-old Lizzie, an unmarried woman, an old maid by the standards of the time, doomed to live in the shadow of her despotic father and a stepmother whom she openly despised. Her life was scheduled by the minute. Church, charitable societies, rare visits, and all of this under the watchful eye of her father, who controlled every cent. The summer of 1892 was unbearably hot. The city was raging with an epidemic of intestinal sickness that had also struck the Borden household. The tension in the family had reached a boiling point. Everyone was on edge, and into this furnace, on the morning of August 4th, something indescribable entered the house on 2nd Street. Something that split the history of Fall River into before and after. Something that made the quiet, respectable town shudder with horror, and to this day whisper about what really happened. Andrew Borden, at 70 years old, was not just the head of the family. He was its absolute monarch. Look at his photographs. A stern, bearded face, a piercing gaze from under overhanging brows, tightly compressed lips. This is the face of a man who had achieved everything in life himself, through hard work and an iron will. The son of a butcher, he started as an undertaker, then made his wealth in furniture sales, and later in real estate and banking. By 1892, his fortune was estimated at $500,000, a fabulous sum for those times. But his wealth did not bring him an easy life. On the contrary, it became his obsession. Andrew Borden was a legendary miser, even in a city that valued thrift. He bought the cheapest meat, stale groceries. His daughters altered old dresses for themselves, while the daughters of other Fall River magnates flaunted Parisian outfits. He refused to install plumbing and electricity in the house, considering it an unnecessary luxury. The family used an outdoor toilet in the yard, despite his wealth. The house on 2nd Street was the embodiment of his character: dark, cramped, uncomfortable. It stood in a business district, not on the prestigious hill where the elite settled. Andrew Borden did not seek their recognition. His world revolved around money, power, and control. He controlled every penny his daughters spent. He made all decisions, big and small. His authority was undisputed. For Lizzie and Emma, his daughters, he was not just a father. He was the jailer of their ambitions and their lives. Abby Durfee Borden, Andrew's second wife, was the complete opposite of her spouse. An obese, slow, sickly woman of 64. She came from a poor family, and having married Andrew after the death of his first wife, seemed to have climbed the social ladder, but her position in the house was as shaky as early spring ice. For Lizzie and Emma Borden, Abby never became a mother. She was a stepmother, and that word in their mouths sounded like a curse. The girls, especially Lizzie, were deeply attached to their late mother and perceived Abby's appearance as a betrayal by their father. There were rumors that Andrew was gradually transferring property to Abby's name, that her relatives, the poor Durfee family, were receiving financial help from Andrew. This only added fuel to the fire of hatred smoldering in Lizzie's heart. Abby, for her part, tried to improve relations, but in vain. For the last few years, Lizzie and Emma had practically not spoken to her. They called her Mrs. Borden behind her back and to her face. They refused to sit at the same table with her. The house was divided into two hostile camps, the father and stepmother in one, the two adult daughters in the other. This Cold War had been going on for years, creating an unbearable, oppressive atmosphere in the house. Lizzie Borden, at 32, was an enigma to Fall River society. Tall, stout, with plain features, she did not fit the ideal of a fragile Victorian lady. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a strong and stubborn character. She was active in the life of the church and engaged in charity work with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Outwardly, she was a respectable, somewhat prim old maid. But inside, very different passions were boiling. Lizzie was deeply unhappy. She was a prisoner in her own home. Her social status as an unmarried woman in a society where marriage was the main goal was humiliating. Her father, despite his wealth, refused to provide her and her sister with a decent living, dooming them to a life full of petty humiliations. And Abby's presence was a constant reminder to her that her late mother had been forgotten, and that her own position in the house was under threat. A few years before the tragedy, a key incident occurred. Andrew Borden gave Abby a house that belonged to her relatives. For Lizzie and Emma, this was the last straw. They perceived it as a direct robbery, as the transfer of their lawful inheritance into the hands of the hated stepmother and her family. They became so angry that they stopped calling Abby mother and began avoiding any contact with her. This gift became the point of no return, after which peaceful coexistence in the house became finally impossible. Lizzie's older sister, Emma, was 10 years her senior. If Lizzie was fire, then Emma was water. Quiet, inconspicuous, obedient, she always remained in the shadow of her younger, brighter, and more determined sister. Emma rarely appeared in public, suffering from various ailments, real or imagined. Their alliance was a union of two outcasts, united by a shared resentment towards their father and hatred for their stepmother. Emma supported Lizzie in everything. It was she who joined her in the boycott against Abby. But on the day of the murders, Emma was not at home. She had gone to visit friends in a neighboring town. Her absence would become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Was it just a coincidence or foresight? To complete the picture, we must mention one more inhabitant of the house, the maid, Bridget Sullivan, a 26-year-old Irish girl hired for housework. She occupied a special, subordinate position. She slept in the attic, worked from morning till night, and was probably the only person in the house not directly involved in the family feud. Her testimony would become crucial for reconstructing the chronology of the fateful day. But her behavior would also raise many questions. It was Bridget who felt the first signs of the approaching storm. The evening before, on August 3rd, the whole family, including Bridget herself, had fallen seriously ill. Severe vomiting, pains. Andrew Borden suspected that the milk delivered that morning had been poisoned. He even went outside and poured it out. Some consider this incident the first failed attempt at murder. Others, just an unfortunate accident, a city epidemic. Such was the balance of power in the Borden house on the morning of August 4, 1892. The tension, built up over years, had reached its peak. The house was ready to explode. And this explosion did not come in the form of a scream or a quarrel. It came in the form of dull, heavy blows from an axe. August 4, 1892, Thursday. Fall River awoke under a scorching sun. The thermometer was already climbing towards 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick and still. The Borden house was filled with the familiar, oppressive routine, burdened by yesterday's illness. Nothing, except the stifling heat, foreshadowed a catastrophe. Now we will reconstruct that day minute by minute, step by step, for in this chronology lie both the keys to the solution and traps for the inattentive mind. 6:30 a.m. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, wakes up in her attic room and begins cleaning. She feels weak after yesterday's illness, but is forced to start work. Approx. 6:45 a.m. Andrew Borden leaves the house to make his morning rounds of his property and stop by the bank. He meets a neighbor on the street, exchanges a few words with him. Nothing about him suggests anxiety. Around 7 a.m., Lizzie and Abby get up. Emma is not home, she is away. Breakfast takes place in an oppressive atmosphere. Lizzie later claims she did not see her stepmother at the morning meal. Abby Borden, apparently, breakfasts separately. Around 8:45 a.m., Abby Borden receives a note from a sick friend asking her to visit him. This note would never be found and became one of the main ghosts of the case. Why would someone summon the woman from the house under a false pretext? Or was the pretext not false? Abby informs Bridget of this and goes up to the guest bedroom to make the bed. 9 a.m. Andrew Borden returns home. He finds the front door locked from the inside with a bolt, a common precaution in those days. He rings the bell, and Bridget, who is washing windows in the sitting room at that moment, lets him in. She notices that he looks unwell and irritated. Lizzie is, according to her, in the dining room or kitchen at this time. Andrew Borden enters the house. Keys, always keys. He hangs up his jacket, takes off his boots, and goes into the sitting room. He sits down in his rocking chair by the window, perhaps to rest or look through the mail. Bridget returns to washing the windows. Lizzie, according to her own testimony, is sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the dining room, sometimes in the pantry on the first floor, where she claims to be looking for sinkers for fishing, and at this time, upstairs in the guest bedroom, Abby Borden is leaning over the bed, straightening the spread. She is standing with her back to the door. Someone enters the room silently. With an axe in hand, the killer delivers 19 blows with a blunt, heavy object, most likely the head of a hatchet. The first blow was probably fatal, crashing into the back of her head. The rest, a furious, excessive overkill. Blood splatters on the wall, the sheets, on Abby's own dress. She falls dead between the bed and the dresser. The killer leaves the room, leaving the door ajar. Abby Borden's body will lie there in a pool of blood for almost an hour and a half before it is discovered. Neither Bridget, busy at the windows, nor Lizzie, who was, according to her, on the floor below, nor Andrew, dozing in his chair. No one hears any screams or suspicious sounds. This would later be called the incredible silence of the murder. 10:40 a.m. Bridget Sullivan, suffering from stomach cramps and the heat, goes up to her attic to lie down. She sees that the door to the guest bedroom is ajar, but does not look inside. She lies down to sleep. Around 10:40 a.m., Lizzie, according to her, comes out of her room on the second floor and goes downstairs. She finds her father sleeping in the chair in the sitting room. She adjusts a pillow under his head. Around 11 a.m., Lizzie calls for Bridget. She comes down from the attic. Lizzie informs her that someone has killed her father. In a panic, Bridget runs to the house of a neighbor, Dr. Bowen, who lives across the street. 11:10 a.m. Dr. Bowen comes to the Borden house and enters the sitting room. The sight that greets him is horrifying. Andrew Borden is lying face down on the sofa. His face, turned towards the back, is mutilated beyond recognition. 11 blows in total. His head is turned into a bloody pulp. On the wall above the sofa, a large spot of blood mixed with brain matter is ominously spread. The murder weapon again, a hatchet or its head. The killer caught the old man by surprise while he slept. There was practically no struggle. Chaos erupts in the house. Neighbors come running. The police are called. Someone, wanting to check if Mrs. Borden is all right, goes upstairs. He looks into the guest bedroom and sees the second body. A cry of horror echoes through the house. Now the picture becomes clear, and it is monstrous. There are 2 bodies in the house, killed with inhuman cruelty. Between the murders, a gap of about an hour and a half. The killer, apparently, was in the house all this time, hiding somewhere between the first and second crime. And here the first, most important oddities begin. From the very beginning, Lizzie Borden gives statements that will change multiple times and raise questions. Where was she? First, she says she was in the backyard, in the barn, where she was looking for sinkers. Then, that she was in the pantry on the first floor. Later, that she went down to the basement. Her alibi is vague and unconvincing. Did she hear anything? She claims she heard no screams, no noise of a struggle, no footsteps of a stranger in the house. Neither during Abby's murder nor during her father's. What was she doing? She says she discovered her father already dead when she came downstairs. But between her last visit to her father, around 10:40 a.m., and the moment she called Bridget, 11 a.m., a full 20 minutes pass. What was she doing all that time? Did she see her stepmother? She insists she had not seen Abby Borden since early morning and suggests that she had left in response to that note. The police, arriving on the scene, are perplexed. The house is locked. No signs of break-in, no obvious signs of robbery. The murder weapon is not found. It seems as if the killer is a ghost who evaporated through the walls. Or he is still here. The only people in the house at the time of the murders are Lizzie Borden and Bridget Sullivan. The atmosphere in the house thickens. Glances involuntarily turn towards the 32-year-old daughter, who is behaving, according to witnesses, oddly calmly for a person who has just found her brutally murdered father. No hysterics, no tears, only an icy, detached calm. And this calm will frighten those around her much more than the bloody slaughter itself. In criminology, there is the concept of circumstantial evidence of behavior, the totality of a suspect's actions, reactions, and words, which, without being physical evidence, paint a convincing picture of involvement. The Lizzie Borden case became a textbook example of how precisely such behavior can become the main basis for an accusation. To understand why suspicion fell specifically on the 32-year-old daughter, we must reconstruct her actions and words in those fateful hours with scrupulous accuracy. Every phrase, every pause, every glance will matter in this detective story, where psychology replaced physical evidence. Let's mentally transport ourselves to that moment. Lizzie Borden, by her own account, comes down into the sitting room and sees her father, Andrew Borden, lying on the sofa. His face is turned towards the back, but even from that angle, something terrible must have been visible. Pools of blood, injuries. What does an ordinary person do upon discovering the mutilated body of a loved one? They scream, call for help, fall into hysterics. Lizzie does none of this. She doesn't make a sound. She turns around, goes up the stairs to the second floor, and calls for the maid. But even here, there is no panic. A neighbor, Mrs. Churchill, who had come out into her yard at that moment, heard not a cry of horror, but a level, even somewhat irritated call, "Bridget, come down." When Bridget appeared, Lizzie, standing on the stairs, said to her, "Bridget, come down. Someone has killed father." The phrase was uttered with a chilling matter-of-factness. The lack of emotion shocked the maid much more than the words themselves. It was not the statement of a shocking fact, but rather the reporting of a vexing nuisance. In these first seconds, Lizzie behaved like a person who either did not fully comprehend the horror of what had happened or was prepared for it. Bridget ran for Dr. Bowen, and Lizzie went out onto the back porch, where Mrs. Churchill approached her. "Mrs. Borden, what has happened?" she asked, already alarmed by the maid's flight. "Oh, Mrs. Churchill," Lizzie replied, "someone came in and killed Father." And here, according to the neighbor's testimony, there were no tears, no hysterics. Lizzie's face was pale, but absolutely calm, her features frozen. Mrs. Churchill, moved by compassion and social instinct, offered her to come to their house to rest, to lie down. Lizzie refused, stating, "No, I must be here." This phrase, "I must be here," is very telling. What was it, filial duty, or the need to control the situation, to observe the development of events that she herself had set in motion? At that moment, one of the strangest and most often quoted phrases of that morning was uttered. Lizzie turned to Mrs. Churchill and asked, "Mrs. Churchill, is it not awful? Do you think the newspapers will write about this?" Let's analyze this remark. At the moment when her father's body, with a smashed skull, lay in the sitting room, her first conscious thought, which she shared with a neighbor, was not the pain of loss, not shock, not fear of the killer, but worry about the family's reputation and how the incident would be reflected in the press. For a Victorian woman whose life was subordinate to conventions and public opinion, this was perhaps a perverse form of deep stress. But for outsiders, for the police, for the jurors who would later judge her, it looked like a manifestation of monstrous selfishness, coldness, and calculation. She was worried not about her father, but about what people would say. When Dr. Bowen arrived, he found Lizzie still on the back porch. He went into the house, saw Andrew Borden's body, and immediately confirmed the death. The examination was brief, but sufficient to understand that the violence was extreme. Coming back out, he witnessed a scene he would later describe in court with great reluctance and caveats. Lizzie was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room, from where there was a view of the body, and on her face, according to the doctor, was a faint, almost a smile. He immediately added that it could have been a nervous reaction, a grimace of shock, an uncontrolled spasm of facial muscles, but the visual impression was so strong, so contradictory to everything he knew about human reactions to death, that he remembered it forever. A daughter's smile over the body of her brutally murdered father. For the Victorian consciousness, this was blasphemy. The chaos grew. Neighbors, acquaintances, the first policemen began to gather in the house. Someone According to one version, it was a neighbor, Charles Sawyer. According to another, Lizzie's cousin, Alice Russell, went upstairs to check if Mrs. Borden was all right. He glanced into the guest bedroom and saw Abby's bloody body. His cry, another one, or "My God, Mrs. Borden is dead too," plunged everyone into a new wave of horror. At this moment, Lizzie was downstairs, in the kitchen or dining room. Her reaction. The testimonies are unanimous, none. She did not rush upstairs, did not ask what had happened, showed not the slightest curiosity or concern about her stepmother's fate. She remained in her place, as if she were prepared for this news, as if the second death was a logical continuation of the first. This silent acceptance of the second victim became, for many, even more suspicious than her calmness after discovering her father. One of the neighbors, Charles Sawyer, approached Lizzie to express his condolences and offer help. And here she made another statement that stunned him. She said to him, "Mr. Sawyer, could you go look for some kind of poison? I'm afraid someone tried to poison us, and that the milk or something else in the house might have been poisoned." Let's analyze this request. First, it demonstrates a striking capacity for rational thinking in a situation that should have paralyzed one's will. Second, it is utterly illogical in the context of what had happened. If a maniac with a hatchet had been rampaging in the house, who had just hacked 2 people to death, fearing poisoned milk was equivalent to being afraid of a draft after a fire. This request looked like an attempt to divert attention, to impose a different version of events, to return to the topic of yesterday's illness, which Lizzie and her lawyers would later try to present as a poisoning attempt. High-ranking police officials, including City Marshal Hilliard and Detective Harrington, began to arrive at the house. Lizzie was moved to a neighbor's house, to Alice Russell's bedroom, where her first official interrogations took place. This was a key moment when her story, told in relative calm, began to fall apart. His conversation with Lizzie lasted about 2 hours. Initially, like everyone else, he treated her with sympathy as a victim of the tragedy. She described her morning in detail. Got up, had breakfast, then her father left, then he returned. Then she went out to the barn for sinkers, then returned and found her father. Everything was smooth until the detective began asking clarifying questions, seeking to determine the smallest details. It was at this level that her version began to show the first, but serious, cracks. Lizzie mentioned that her stepmother, Abby Borden, had received a note from some sick person asking her to come that morning. This was crucial for her alibi, as it explained why Abby was in the guest bedroom. She was supposedly preparing for the visit, and why no one heard her screams. She wasn't in the house at the time of the father's murder. and when she returned, the killer was waiting for her upstairs. When asked directly if she had seen the note herself, Lizzie replied, "No, Bridget told me about it." This was the first version. When Bridget Sullivan was questioned separately, she stated that she herself had heard about the note from Lizzie and had not personally seen this note. The circle was closed. No one except Lizzie had seen this note. The police combed the entire house, searched the pockets of Abby's dress. The note was never found. It became a ghost, the cornerstone of Lizzie's alibi, which existed only in her words. For the investigators, this was a bright red flag, a sign of a lie. Lizzie insisted that she spent about 20 minutes, maybe more, in the barn. She described sorting through old junk looking for sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip. The detectives, being practical people, physically checked this alibi. The barn was small, stuffy, crammed with old things and carpentry tools. In the summer heat, the temperature inside could reach unbearable levels. Dust hung in the air. Spending 20 minutes there, just looking at old junk in search of some sinkers that were never found, would have been an act of masochism. No ventilation, no air movement. This alibi seemed contrived and unnatural. It was too perfect an explanation for her absence from the house during the key period, but at the same time too implausible from a practical standpoint. The detective methodically asked Lizzie if she had changed her clothes that day. This was a standard question in search of possible blood stains. Lizzie categorically denied it, stating that she was wearing the same dark blue silk jersey dress she had put on in the morning. She emphasized that she had changed into it the previous evening. This seemed a trivial matter, but the police were already beginning to think about possible bloodied clothing, and her persistent denial of having changed clothes was recorded. As we will learn later, this would become one of the most serious mistakes in her defense. To understand why Lizzie's behavior aroused such distrust, it is not enough to look at it from the perspective of the 21st century. One must deeply immerse oneself in the social norms and expectations of American society at the end of the 19th century, especially in conservative Protestant enclaves like Fall River. From women, especially from the upper and middle classes, public, almost theatrical displays of emotion were expected. Grief, sorrow, shock were supposed to be demonstrative. The death of a loved one, especially such a cruel and sudden one by unwritten rules, was to be accompanied by fainting, hysterics, sobbing, complete physical and mental prostration. A woman who maintained composure in such a situation was perceived as abnormal, unwomanly, morally flawed. Her strength of spirit was interpreted not as courage, but as callousness, heartlessness, or even as a sign of guilt. Lizzie violated this fundamental code of conduct, and society immediately delivered its verdict. Lizzie, from the very beginning, tried not just to answer questions, but to actively shape the narrative. She was the first to talk about the note, about a possible poisoning, about her alibi in the barn. She gave instructions, made arrangements, put forward theories. She behaved not as a passive victim, an object of sympathy and care, but as an active participant in events, which for a woman of her circle, age, and position was uncharacteristic and even reprehensible in the eyes of society. This was perceived not as resourcefulness, but as manipulation, as an attempt to take control of an investigation that was the prerogative of men, policemen, and detectives. Lizzie never once expressed fear that the killer might still be in the house or would return. She did not ask for protection for herself, did not look frightened, did not cling to the male neighbors as saviors. On the contrary, she demonstrated complete control over the space and the situation. This contradicted the image of a fragile, defenseless Victorian woman, the weaker sex. Her independence and fearlessness frightened and repelled. They made one wonder: did she feel safe because she knew the killer was gone? The Borden family was rich, but not one of their own to the old aristocracy of Fall River. They were considered misers, coarse and uncouth people. Lizzie, with her stubborn character and plain appearance, had already been the subject of gossip before this. Her behavior on the day of the murders only confirmed the prejudiced opinion for many. There's something wrong with that family. They're not like us. Prejudice worked against her, making her strange behavior even more suspicious in the eyes of the public. By the end of the day on August 4th, the police had no direct physical evidence against Lizzie Borden. There was no murder weapon. No bloodied clothing was found. There were no witnesses. But they had something that in a Victorian court could prove no less weighty than material evidence: a totality of behavioral clues and a violation of social norms. Her icy calm, her changing and unconvincing statements, her strange questions and requests, her unwomanly firmness, all this formed a picture that, in the eyes of the investigators and society, unequivocally pointed to her guilt. The trap of public opinion and circumstantial evidence was beginning to snap shut, and its loudest click sounded 2 days later, when the absence of a certain dark blue dress was discovered in the kitchen stove of the house on 2nd Street. Over the following days, the pressure on Lizzie steadily increased. The Borden house became a place of pilgrimage for reporters, curious townspeople, and of course, the police. The investigators worked methodically, and each new interview, each new search brought more and more circumstantial evidence, which, like pieces of a mosaic, formed the image of the guilty party. In conversations with neighbors and acquaintances, information about the difficult family relationships began to surface. Although no one could point to open scandals, everyone unanimously spoke of a deep antipathy between Lizzie and her stepmother, Abby Borden. They recalled the story of the gifted house that Andrew had transferred to Abby's relatives, which had caused a long and silent feud between the daughters and their father. The police began to see a possible motive: money and hatred. The murder of the father and stepmother would give Lizzie and Emma access to a fortune of $500,000 without having to share it with the hated stepmother and her relatives. The police conducted a thorough search of the house and grounds. In the basement, they found a hatchet with a broken handle. It looked clean, almost polished, but there were fresh scratches on the metal, as if it had recently been sharpened or cleaned with an abrasive. Although experts were never able to definitively prove that this particular hatchet was the murder weapon, there were no traces of blood or fibers from the victim's clothing. The find itself was significant. It proved that a suitable tool was in the house, and that someone had made efforts to clean it up precisely in the last few days. Soon, the police approached the owner of a local drugstore. He confirmed that a few days before the murders, Lizzie Borden had come to him and tried to buy a powerful poison, prussic acid, under the pretext that she needed to clean a fur cape of moths. The druggist refused to sell her the poison without a prescription. This story connected with her earlier request to find some kind of poison on the day of the murder, created a sinister image of a woman obsessed with thoughts of poison. The prosecution would later use this episode as evidence of preparation for murder by poisoning, which failed, forcing the criminal to resort to more crude methods. The newspapers, especially the Fall River Herald, were already conducting their own hunt. They savored every strange detail of Lizzie's behavior, every rumor about family strife. The image of an unwomanly, cold, and calculating old maid capable of a terrible crime fit perfectly into sensational headlines. Public opinion, fueled by the press, demanded an arrest more and more loudly. The police found themselves between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, a lack of direct evidence. On the other, growing public pressure. And the investigators' conviction of her guilt. On August 6th, 2 days after the murders, a turning point occurred. The family's host, Alice Russell, was approached by John Morse, the uncle of Lizzie and Emma, who was visiting town. Morse reported shocking news to the investigators. On Saturday morning, August 6th, just 2 days after the murders, he had personally seen Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove. when he asked her why she was doing it. Lizzie allegedly replied that the dress was old and stained with paint during recent painting work for the police. This was the missing link. They immediately called Lizzie in for another interrogation. Lizzie confirmed that she had indeed burned a dress. She described it as an old, blue, cornflower-colored dress that had been ruined after paint got on it when she accidentally brushed against a freshly painted door or fence. Her testimony on this point varied slightly. She insisted that she had done it simply because the dress was spoiled and beyond repair. However, here she made a fatal mistake. Earlier, on the day of the murder, in response to Detective Harrington's question about whether she had changed clothes, Lizzie had categorically denied it, claiming she had been in the same dress all day. Now it turned out that she had had at least one other blue dress, which she had destroyed. Why had she concealed its existence? For the investigators, the answer was obvious, because it was the very dress in which she had committed the murders, and on which splashes of Abby and Andrew Borden's blood had landed. The destruction of physical evidence was the act of a desperate, guilty person. The defense, of course, offered a different explanation. In the Victorian era, it was common practice to burn old, worn-out clothing, especially if it was stained with something persistent like paint. Lizzie might simply not have attached importance to this fact during the first interrogation, being in shock, or did not deem it necessary to mention every item in her wardrobe. But in conjunction with all the other oddities, this act looked extremely suspicious. The destruction of the dress became the point of no return. For City Marshal Hilliard and District Attorney Knowlton, it was enough. They believed that the totality of behavioral evidence, motive, and the fact of the destruction of potential physical evidence gave them sufficient grounds for an arrest. On August 11, 1892, exactly 1 week after the murders, a group of officials led by Marshal Hilliard appeared on the doorstep of the house on 2nd Street. Lizzie Borden was invited into the sitting room. Marshal Hilliard was straightforward. He read her the arrest warrant. Formally, she was charged with the murder of Abby Borden. The murder of Andrew Borden was added to the charge later. The reason for this selectivity was legal. The time of Abby's death had been established more precisely, before 9:30 a.m., and the police had witnesses who had seen Lizzie active and in the house precisely during that period. Lizzie's reaction to the arrest was in the same vein as her behavior all previous days. There were no protests, no tears, no fainting. Maintaining her icy calm, she listened to the charge, asked only for permission to put on her hat and gloves, and followed the officers to the waiting carriage. She was taken to the city jail, where she was placed in a cell specially prepared for her more comfortable than the regular cells, but a jail nonetheless. This arrest shook Fall River to its foundations. Society was split. Some, led by the newspapers and rumors, saw in her a monster in a skirt, a cold-blooded patricide. Others, especially from her church circle and high society, could not believe that a respectable, pious woman, their peer, was capable of such a villainy. They saw in her a victim of police incompetence and prejudice. From this moment on, the case of Lizzie Borden passed from the realm of investigation into the realm of law and public theater. She was to stand trial, which would go down in history as one of the most famous trials of the 19th century. She was to fight not only the prosecution's charges, but also the prejudice of an entire era against a woman who dared to behave improperly. Lizzie Borden's arrest did not put an end to the investigation, but on the contrary, gave it a new, powerful impetus. The police and the prosecution now had months to meticulously gather all the evidence, line it up in a single chain, and prepare for a trial that promised to be the main spectacle of the season. This part of our narrative is about how the case for the prosecution was built, about the physical evidence that was lacking, about the rumors that became evidence, and about the titanic work of the defense, which was already preparing for battle. The police conducted several thorough searches of the house on 2nd Street. Their finds were both eloquent and disappointing. As we already know, a hatchet with a broken handle was found in the basement. It was clean, with no visible traces of blood. The expert pathologists who performed the autopsies were able to determine that the blows were inflicted by a blunt, heavy object with a relatively narrow striking surface, consistent with the head of a hatchet. However, they were unable to conclusively link this specific hatchet to the crime. No other suitable tools were found, neither in the house nor on the property. This was a huge gap in the prosecution's case. The inspection of the house revealed an astonishing thing. Given the monstrous cruelty of the murders, accompanied by profuse bleeding, there were practically no traces of blood in the house beyond the immediate crime scenes. There were no bloody footprints, no splashes on the corridor walls, no traces of washing. This suggested that the killer had acted with incredible caution, or was wearing some kind of protective clothing, which was later destroyed, or else was so familiar with the layout of the house that he could move through it without getting dirty. The destroyed dress. This remained the most weighty, albeit circumstantial, piece of evidence. The fact of its burning was established, but what was it? An innocent disposal of an old item, or the destruction of physical evidence? The prosecution insisted on the latter. They argued that Lizzie had put some simple, easily removable garment over her dress. perhaps even her father's dressing gown, committed the murders, and then burned it along with the bloodied dress. The dress itself was evidence that was impossible to refute because it no longer existed. The police never found the very note that, according to Lizzie, had come for Abby Borden. They interviewed all the neighbors, mail carriers, acquaintances. No one had seen anyone deliver a note, and no one knew of any sick friend who could have sent it. For the prosecution, this was proof of the falsity of Lizzie's alibi. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton and William Moody, built a version based on two pillars: deep personal hatred and financial gain. The story of the gifted house became a central element of the motive. The prosecution argued that this act by Andrew Borden was the last straw for Lizzie and Emma. It showed that their father placed the interests of his wife and her relatives above those of his own daughters. The sisters' complete ignoring of Abby in recent years was cited as evidence of irreconcilable enmity. Andrew Borden was a very wealthy man. After his and Abby's deaths, their fortune was to pass to Lizzie and Emma by removing her stepmother. Lizzie, and possibly Emma as an accomplice, not only removed the object of her hatred, but also ensured her sole possession of the inheritance. The prosecution emphasized that Lizzie was dissatisfied with her father's stinginess, his refusal to move to a more prestigious area, and his control over their lives. The death of her parents opened the doors to money and freedom for her. The episode of the attempted purchase of poison and the collective illness of the family, the day before the murders, fit into this version. The prosecution suggested that Lizzie first tried to poison both parents, but when that failed, she couldn't get the poison, and the food she possibly spoiled only caused mild illness. She moved on to a more reliable, though extremely risky, plan with the hatchet. While the prosecution was gathering evidence, Lizzie Borden's defense was not idle. Her family hired one of the best legal teams in New England, led by George D. Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts. This was a strategic move. Robinson was not only a brilliant lawyer, but also a respected, charismatic man whose word carried weight in society. The defense immediately set out to challenge every point of the accusation: the destroyed dress, a mundane household chore, calm behavior, shock and the natural reserve of a lady, an unconvincing alibi. The girl was confused and frightened. Their main trump card was to be the complete absence of direct evidence: no weapon, no witnesses, no blood on Lizzie. In the fall and winter of 1892, preliminary hearings were held, at which the prosecution presented its evidence. The press covered them greedily, and each day brought new sensational headlines. public opinion in Fall River and beyond was increasingly divided. By the time the trial began in June 1893, the atmosphere in the city and the country was tense to the limit. What lay ahead was not just a court proceeding, but a social and cultural battle. At stake was not only the life of Lizzie Borden, but also the reputation of an entire city and the foundations of society itself. June 5, 1893. The building of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in New Bedford. The air in the courtroom is thick with tension and summer heat. The cream of New England society, reporters from major newspapers, and simply the curious have gathered here, ready to witness the trial already dubbed the trial of the century. At the center of attention is 33-year-old Lizzie Borden, accused of patricide, the most heinous crime, unthinkable for a woman of her circle. She was to stand before a jury of her peers that would decide her fate. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, an experienced and determined prosecutor, began by outlining the version of the investigation. His speech was in strict, unemotional tones, but no less formidable for it. He promised the jurors to present irrefutable evidence that only Lizzie Borden had the opportunity, motive, and means to commit this double murder. He dwelt in detail on the financial gain she would receive and on the deep, long-standing hatred for her stepmother. A key point of his speech was the emphasis on the unnatural and unfeeling behavior of the accused after the discovery of the bodies. The objection from the defense was voiced by Andrew Jennings, one of the senior attorneys. His strategy was different. He did not immediately dispute the evidence, but appealed to the prejudices and social attitudes of the jurors. Gentlemen, he addressed them, you are to decide whether a woman, raised in strict Christian traditions, the daughter of one of the most respected citizens of Fall River, is capable of an act of such unthinkable barbarity. He painted a portrait of Lizzie as a victim of tragic circumstances and the hasty conclusions of a police force that had failed to find the real criminal. Next began the calling of witnesses. The first were neighbors and policemen who described in detail the ghastly scene that had met them in the house on 2nd Street. Their testimonies created an atmosphere of horror and cruelty, against which the image of the calm Lizzie looked more and more sinister. Dr. Bowen's repetition of his observation about a faint smile on Lizzie's face made a particular impression on the jury. Lizzie Borden herself remained an enigmatic and unflappable figure throughout the trial. She never testified her right, which she exercised on the advice of her lawyers. Instead, she sat day after day in her place, dressed in modest but expensive dark dresses, often with a Bible in her hands. Her behavior was impeccable. No emotional outbursts, no tears, only stoic calm. For some, this was proof of her innocence and strength of spirit. For others, confirmation of her composure and guilt. The defense did not so much prove Lizzie's innocence as dismantle the prosecution's construction. The trial turned into an arena of intellectual combat between the two legal teams. Cross-examinations became the place where the case was won or lost. The forensic medicine of the time significantly limited the possibilities of establishing the truth. Despite the official version, the case retained many blank spots, giving rise to alternative theories. The atmosphere in the courtroom on those June days of 1893 was like the air before a thunderstorm, thick, heavy, charged with hidden passions. Each day, processions, almost ritualistic, followed one another. First, Lizzie was brought in always in dark colors, always with downcast eyes, a Bible in lace gloves. Then the 12 men, the jurors, took their seats, their faces having become frozen masks over the days, concealing their thoughts, and only then did the judge enter authority and law in one person. This was not just a trial. It was a spectacle played out on the very edge between vice and virtue, between what was considered possible and what seemed unthinkable. The prosecution, in order to expose the true springs of the tragedy, began slowly, layer by layer, to remove the veils of decency from the Borden family life. They called servants, past and present, neighbors, business partners of Andrew, and from these testimonies, fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, a portrait emerged of a house more like a prison for the spirit. Witness after witness painted a picture of life reduced to absurdity by Andrew Borden's thrift. They spoke of rotten meat served at the table, of the family crowding into a house more suitable for a shopkeeper than for one of the city's wealthiest men. They said that the bedroom doors did not lock, so that the father could exercise his control at any moment. But the most eloquent thing was not words, but silence. The very silence that had settled between Lizzie, Emma, and their stepmother several years before the murders. The fact that they had stopped eating together, talking, calling Abby mother, hung in the courtroom as a heavy, unspoken reproach. This silence was, perhaps, more weighty evidence than any physical proof. It spoke of hatred, cold, mature, aged like strong vinegar. Lizzie's attorneys, led by former Governor Robinson, did not challenge every minor point. They chose a different tactic, the tactic of precise, devastating strikes. Their goal was not to prove Lizzie's innocence, but to sow in the minds of the jurors that very reasonable doubt, which is the cornerstone of justice. And they struck precisely at the weak points of the accusation. When the prosecutor spoke with pathos about the burned dress, Robinson would stand up and in his velvety, calm voice ask, "Does not every housewife in Fall River have the right to burn an old, stained dress? Or shall we try them all?" When the accusation insisted on the impossibility of an outsider's penetration, the defense pointed to the unlocked basement door, the busy street, the fact that the house was not a fortress. Their main trump card was the complete, absolute absence of direct evidence. No one saw Lizzie raise the hatchet. No one found a drop of blood on her. The murder weapon itself was never established. The hatchet from the basement, clean, without traces. Evidence? No, just one of many items in the house. The defense masterfully turned the lack of evidence into its advantage. "Gentlemen," they told the jurors, "you are being asked to convict a woman on the basis of guesses, rumors, and oddities of behavior. But where are the facts? Where is the iron, irrefutable certainty required by law to deprive a person of life?" And what of Lizzie herself? She sat, motionless as a statue, her face, usually inexpressive, at moments of particularly sharp testimony, froze into a mask of cold contempt. She did not cry, scream, or protest. This silence, this icy armor, became both her defense and her accusation simultaneously. The prosecution, unable to attack her directly, attacked her essence, her character, her strangeness, her nonconformity to the ideal of a fragile, emotional woman. Every testimony about her calmness after finding the bodies, every story about her stubbornness and independence laid the foundation for an unspoken accusation. She is not like us. And since she is not like us, she is capable of anything. Prosecutor Knowlton, in his closing argument, came close to this, almost crossing the line. He spoke of the demon that can lurk in a person's soul, of the passions boiling under the mask of respectability. He did not call Lizzie possessed, but it was implied. He called on the jury to look behind the veil of Victorian conventions and see the cruel reality that, in his opinion, lay behind the accused's lace cuffs and silk dress. He was countered by Robinson. His closing speech was a masterpiece of oratory. He was not defending the crime, he was defending the very idea of innocence. He appealed not to facts, but to faith. "Can you believe?" he asked, sweeping his gaze over the jurors. "You, gentlemen, fathers of families, Christians, can you believe that this woman sitting here, the daughter of that very Andrew Borden, could have done such a thing? Can your reason accept it? Can your soul reconcile itself to it?" He was staking not on evidence, but on the moral principles of the jurors themselves. He was asking them not to acquit Lizzie, but not to commit the sin of condemning an innocent person. And then came the moment when the words ended. The speeches of the sides fell silent. The final instructions of Judge Mason, dry and dispassionate like the pages of a penal code, were read. The 12 men, whose faces had become familiar to all present over the course of the trial, retired to the deliberation room. The door closed behind them with a quiet but final click. What followed next was perhaps the most difficult ordeal of all these weeks of the trial. The waiting. It stretched for an hour, then 2. The courtroom emptied, but no one went far. People crowded in the corridors, at the doors leading to the hall, as if afraid to miss the decisive moment. Journalists, forgetting propriety, pressed against the doors of the deliberation room in a vain hope of catching fragments of the debate. Lizzie Borden was taken to an adjacent room. It was said that she sat by the window, looking at the rain, and her face showed neither anxiety nor hope. Only the same frozen, unreadable expression behind which she had hidden all these long months. Her sister, Emma, pale as a sheet, did not leave her side, and in their silent posture, one could guess the whole history of their shared life, a life in the shadow of their father's house, in each other's shadow, and now in the shadow of the guillotine of justice. The attorneys paced the corridor, pretending to discuss unrelated matters, but their glances constantly returned to the fateful door. Prosecutor Knowlton stood apart, his face tense. He had invested all his skill, all his energy into this case, and now the fate of his labor was in the hands of 12 ordinary men. And the rain outside the window kept intensifying, its beat becoming intrusive, like the ticking of a clock counting down the last seconds of someone's fate. About an hour and a half passed. Suddenly, a commotion was heard at the end of the corridor. The door to the courtroom swung open, and the clerk shouted that the jury was returning. This was the swiftest, and at the same time, the slowest moment in the life of everyone in the courthouse. People poured into the hall, taking their seats, jostling, forgetting all conventions. When Lizzie was brought in and seated in her place, a dead silence fell in the room. The pounding of the rain outside the window was audible. The jurors entered. Their faces expressed nothing, neither condemnation nor acquittal, only fatigue and concentration. The judge addressed them with the one most important question. Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon a verdict? The foreman of the jury, Mr. Raymond, rose. In his hand was a small piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. His voice sounded loud and clear in the tomb-like silence. The clerk took the paper from him and unfolded it. He seemed to be doing it deliberately, slowly. Then he looked around the room and read, "On the charge of murder of Abby Durfee Borden, not guilty." A suppressed gasp swept through the room, but it was immediately interrupted by the clerk's voice. "On the charge of murder of Andrew Jackson Borden, not guilty. For a moment, there was absolute silence, which was immediately shattered by a deafening uproar. Shouts, exclamations, weeping, all merged into a single chaotic din. Some rejoiced, others were indignant. Reporters rushed to the doors to be the first to relay the sensational news. And Lizzie Borden, it seemed that a shadow of something, perhaps relief, perhaps triumph, flitted across her face for a split second, but it immediately faded. She did not smile, did not cry. She slowly rose, straightened her dress, and without looking at anyone, accompanied by her lawyers and sister, walked out of the courtroom to freedom. She was acquitted not for a lack of evidence, but for their complete, total absence. She left as much of an enigma as she had entered. Freedom. What did it mean for Lizzie Borden? Leaving the courthouse on that rainy evening, the house on 2nd Street awaited her, empty and ominous. The city of Fall River was split into two camps: those who praised the justice system, and those who saw in the verdict the triumph of money and privilege. But for Lizzie herself, freedom turned out to be very conditional. She was free from the prison cell, but not from the court of public opinion, not from the heavy gaze of her neighbors, not from the ghosts that had now forever taken up residence in her home. Lizzie and Emma Borden inherited their father's fortune. They were rich, but their social life was destroyed. Fall River's high society, which had so recently defended its victim, now shunned them. Invitations to social events stopped coming. Old acquaintances crossed to the other side of the street upon seeing the sisters. They sold the cursed house on 2nd Street and bought a spacious mansion on the hill, in the prestigious district that had never accepted them. Lizzie named it Maplecroft. It was a beautiful, large house, but for the townspeople it forever remained the house of the patricide. Behind a high fence, the sisters tried to build a new life, but the shadow of the past was inescapable. Lizzie changed her name to Lisbeth A. Borden, as if trying to shed the burden of her former identity. She took up charity work, donated money to the church, and helped the poor. But even these gestures were perceived ambiguously. Some saw in them atonement, others an attempt to buy society's favor. The relationship between Lizzie and Emma, so strong during the years of the trial and investigation, developed cracks over time. What caused it is unknown. Perhaps Emma, always more conservative and pious, was burdened by the eternal atmosphere of scandal. Perhaps a conversation took place between them, the content of which we will never know. In 1905, after a quarrel for reasons that remain a secret, Emma packed her things and left Maplecroft forever. She moved to Newport, breaking off all contact with her sister. They never saw each other again. This break became the final tragedy in Lizzie's life. Even her sister, her main defender and ally, could not bear the burden of their shared secret. Lizzie was left alone in her big house. She surrounded herself with servants, collected expensive trinkets, and raised pigeons. But luxury could not fill the void. She became eccentric, suspicious, afraid of robbers and attacks. Her life turned into a voluntary confinement. Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, from pneumonia. She was 66 years old. At her funeral, contrary to her will, there were no flowers, only a few former servants and distant relatives came to say goodbye. Emma, who outlived her sister by just 9 days, did not attend the funeral. But with Lizzie's death, her story did not end. It began a new life, the life of a myth. The scary rhyme, known today to every American child, was born almost immediately after the murders. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. In these lines lies the whole essence of the myth: simplification, distortion. Abby was not her biological mother. There were fewer blows, but also ruthless memorability. Lizzie forever remained in popular culture as a cold-blooded patricide with a hatchet in her hands. Her name became a byword. It symbolizes family secrets, unsolved crimes, the dark side of respectable society. The house on 2nd Street became a museum and a haven for ghost hunters, convinced that the ghosts of Abby and Andrew still roam its rooms. The case of Lizzie Borden was never officially closed. It remains an eternal mystery, having spawned countless theories, books, plays, and films. Was she an innocent victim of circumstances, or a brilliant criminal who managed to cheat justice? There is still no definitive answer. Her story is a mirror in which society sees its deepest fears. The fear of the family as a source of violence, the fear of a woman who violates all norms, the fear that evil can lurk behind the most respectable facade. Lizzie Borden won her trial, but she lost the war for her own soul in the memory of posterity. She gained immortality, but at the cost of an eternal curse. Decades passed. Fall River changed. The textile factories that built Andrew Borden's fortune closed one after another. The city grew quiet, sank into slumber. But the house on 2nd Street still stands, attracting the glances of passers-by. It is now a museum. Tourists from all over the world come here to touch the legend, to feel the chill from touching the doorjamb on which, it is claimed, a stain from Abby Borden's blood is still visible. What remains of Lizzie Borden? Not a woman, a myth, not a life, a riddle. The fortune of Andrew Borden, which became the apple of discord, did not bring happiness to Lizzie. After Emma's death in 1927, the entire huge inheritance passed to distant relatives and charity. Maplecroft was sold at auction. Lizzie's personal belongings were scattered among collectors. Only a few photographs and court records preserve the memory of the one who was one of the wealthiest women in New England, and at the same time, one of the loneliest. They say that in her last years, she was a recluse. She was afraid of windows. She covered the furniture with white sheets, as if the house was in perpetual mourning. Her only companions were servants and flocks of pigeons that she fed in the garden. Money became for her not a blessing, but a more sophisticated form of prison. The 21st century, with its DNA analysis, digital forensics, and psychological profiling, returns to the Borden case again and again. What could modern science reveal? The debates do not subside to this day. On the internet, on forums, in scholarly articles, and at bar counters, people continue to divide into two camps. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, or it does not exist at all. The story of Lizzie Borden is not a detective story. It is a parable. It is not about who struck, but about how thin the line is between respectability and barbarism, about how family hatred, accumulated over years, can spill out in a bloody flood, about how society is ready to tear apart anyone who does not fit into its framework. Everyone who reads about this case finds something of their own in it, some justification for their dark thoughts, others horror at the injustice of the world, others confirmation that evil wears the mask of decency. The house on 2nd Street is silent. It keeps its secret. And we, the descendants, remain standing before it with one single, eternal question to which there is no answer.